Well, these comments barely scratch the surface of the formation and implementation of policy during the unipolar moment, but I think they're characteristic. One significant element is the continuity of planning and interpretation since World War II, when the United States shouldered the responsibility that was eloquently described by Winston Churchill, the responsibility to protect the interests of the satisfied nations, whose power places us above the rest, the rich men dwelling in peace within their habitations, to whom the government of the world must be entrusted, now under Washington's guiding hand. And that remains the operative meaning of the fashionable phrase, responsibility to protect. Thanks.
We will field some questions. We'll field some questions, as you said. Yeah. Okay. Let me say that Professor Chomsky, we have time for people from the audience to pose some questions for him. There are, I see a couple of microphones here, and given the unsteady acoustics in this room, it would be a good idea for anyone who wants to pose a question to just come up to one of these two microphones in the center aisle. So I invite anyone who wants to ask a question to just come up, and we will hear you. Go ahead.
Thanks for your talk. My question is about Afghanistan. We hear a lot in the corporate media about why we're in Afghanistan and why we need to expand the number of troops there, how that might hasten the end of the war somehow, and we're in there to fight Al-Qaeda because they're a threat to us, and so forth. Why do you think that the United States is in Afghanistan? What do you think the real mission is?
We can go back to the original invasion. You heard a version of the story from Obama a couple of nights ago, but there's also reality, not just invention. And it's pretty easy to check. You know, it's not obscure. I mean, you're not going to find it in the front pages, but a little work and you'll dig it out. So it was supposedly a reaction to 9/11. We had to defend ourselves from terror. Well, let's imagine that protection of the population from terror was a high priority of the government. It's almost unimaginable, but suppose it were true. Well, they had some very straightforward ways to proceed. I'm sure their specialists in the State Department could have informed them that the jihadi movement was highly critical of Osama bin Laden. They bitterly condemned 9/11. I mean, there were fatwas coming out from the most radical clerics in Al-Azhar University, the most important university, denouncing Osama bin Laden and so on. So there was a perfect opportunity to split the jihadi movement, isolate Osama bin Laden, and significantly reduce the threat of terror. Instead, they chose to do the opposite, to act in a way which united the jihadi movement, and then invading Iraq, of course, did so even more. As one of innumerable examples that protecting the population is not a high priority of this government or governments in general. So that would have been one reaction. Now, of course, there was a serious crime, not as serious as 9/11, 1973, but still very serious. So what do you do when there's a crime? Well, you try to identify the perpetrators, capture them. If it's an international issue, use international forces, no problem in this case, and bring them to trial and have a fair trial. Well, they couldn't do that. They didn't try to do that, and there's a good reason, which was explained later on. 8 months after 9/11, the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, had interviews with the Washington Post in which he told them that we really don't know who was responsible. He says, we believe that the plot was hatched in Afghanistan but implemented in the United Arab Emirates and Germany. Well, if they only could believe it in April, they didn't know it the preceding October, which is why they did not respond. Presumably, that's the reason why they didn't respond to the Taliban when they, who had made tentative offers to extradite Osama bin Laden, but wanted to see some evidence. That's what you do when you ask for extradition. And of course, this was contemptuously rejected. So we went ahead and bombed. That's a major war crime. First of all, there was no international authorization of any kind, totally violated international law, but it was a moral war crime in a deeper sense. You have to go back to that time. At that time, there were an estimated 5 million Afghans. They were right at the edge of starvation. And it was predicted, the aid agencies, which all had to flee, warned repeatedly and loudly that if the U.S. bombed, it would put at risk another 2.5 million people. Well, fortunately the worst didn't happen, but that's not the way you estimate the moral character of an action. You estimate it on the basis of likely consequences. So they were willing to take a risk of killing another 2.5 million Afghans in order to achieve their ends. Well, what were the ends? Not to end terror, plainly. Actually, I think the ends were pretty well described by some of the leading anti-Taliban Afghans, including the U.S. favorite, Abdul Haq, who was later killed. They strongly, strenuously objected to the bombing. They said the bombing is just killing innocent civilians. It's undermining our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within, which they thought pretty reasonably could succeed. And you're only doing it because you want to show your muscle and intimidate the world. And of course, Afghanistan has, unfortunately for Afghans, a strategic location right on the periphery of the major oil-producing regions in the Middle East and Central Asia and, of course, South Asia. And that goes way back in history, and they've suffered for it. So we don't have documents yet, internal documents. Maybe we'll get them someday. But it looks as if those were the reasons. Well, why is it continuing? Well, we don't have documents from today either. Incidentally, you heard the other night that the world supported us in the bombing. Well, that depends very much on how you define the world. So, for example, if the world includes the people of the world, we know the answer. You have to do a little work to find the answer, but it's not really difficult in these internet days, and there are books, mine, others, that talk about it. But right after the bombing was announced, but before it started, there was an international Gallup poll all over the world, which asked people whether they were in favor of bombing. Now, the question was asked on the assumption that it would be selective. It would go after the perpetrators, and those civilians would be attacked, which, of course, never happened. And on that assumption, there was very little support. Only 2 countries had even majority support. One was India, the other was Israel. But India and Israel, I don't think were even thinking about Afghanistan. India was thinking about Kashmir, and Israel was thinking about the Palestinians. So, yeah, you want to go bomb people, great. Let's bomb Pakistan. But even in Europe, the numbers were like in the 20 to 30 percentile. But most interesting were the Latin American answers. Latin America had a little bit of experience with U.S. intervention. In Latin America, the figures support range from 2% in Mexico, that is the half of Mexico that we didn't conquer. 2% support there. It went up to, I think, 11% in Colombia. And even in Panama, which is practically a U.S. colony, it was like 16% or something. Well, that was the popular support for the bombing on the assumption that it wouldn't hit civilians, which of course it did. The media cooperated by not reporting it. An international Gallup poll on an issue like that is kind of important, so therefore it's better suppressed. Why are we staying? As I said, we don't have internal documents, but I suspect it's partly the same reasons, the strategic location and so on and so forth. There's probably another factor. It's what Dan Ellsberg called the, what did he call it, the stalemate machine, I think, when he was writing about U.S. policies in Vietnam through the 60s. He said, kind of accurately, I think the document supported it, that the idea was to just keep it going so you don't lose the next election. If you wanted to win the war, I mean, in my opinion, the U.S. actually did win the war in Vietnam, but that's another story. But if you wanted to reach the maximum goals, you would have had to move up to nuclear warfare or something like that. And to reach the maximal goals here, it's not even clear how you would do that. But you don't want to, be attacked as soft, wimpish, not courageous like Theodore Roosevelt and those good guys that we honor. So it's probably that the stalemate machine is probably a factor. I mean, the plans that were announced the other day make absolutely no sense on any grounds. But we're not going to suffer from it except paying. The Afghans will suffer as usual, and the Pakistanis, who may be in real trouble if this continues.
We're going to get. Do you want to sit?
No,
okay.
That's okay.
The next question.
What about China doing deals in Africa? Resources, inking deals, pardon the pun, in the Middle East, unipolar version of the official story. Are you turning are they the new Aryans? Are you turning your attention to them these days?
Yeah, I'm turning my attention to them, but they're pursuing, you can like them or hate them, whatever you like, but on these issues they're pursuing peaceful means. Like they're not overthrowing governments. They don't have 800 military bases around the world. They don't outspend the rest of the world combined in, military and intelligence expenditures. They're not pursuing the militarization of space. In fact, they're leading the way in global opposition to it. They're not occupying two countries as we are. So, they're pursuing their own interests, trying to gain control over resources. A lot of it's very ugly. So, like supporting the Burmese military, which they do by getting oil from Burma, as incidentally does the United States. Under Chevron has contracts there, and even more so Britain and France. That's ugly. But it's a long way from military intervention. In fact, they have a lot of rotten things inside, but outside the borders, they're nothing much to complain about.
Okay, the next.
I want to thank you for your lecture. I have a broader question. Edward Said used to quote a poet, a Caribbean poet, and he used to say there's room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. We live in a time of unipolar dominance. Do you think U.S. hegemony is ever going to decrease and not be replaced by another polarizing system?
Do you think that our unipolar hegemony will eventually be replaced by some multipolar system at some point, or is it inevitable?
Well, the world is, for the last several decades, economically at least, on the economic dimension, the world's becoming considerably more diverse. So, in 1950, after the war, the United States had literally half the world's wealth. By 1970, it was down to 25%, and now it's maybe 20%. And centers of economic power have been developing. Like Europe is roughly comparable to the United States, in some respects richer. Northeast Asia, the tigers, and now China and India to an extent, are becoming another center of world power. I mean, they're nowhere near the power of the United States. So, actually, I know a historian who teaches in a state college who asks her students every year, freshmen, what they think are the richest countries in the world. And their answers are India and China. Okay, you read the newspapers, you might think those are the richest countries in the world. If you look up the Human Development Index, you find that India, I think, is around 130th or something, and China's around maybe 90th, and it would probably be lower if it wasn't so totalitarian and you could actually find out what's going on inside. But yeah, they're growing powers in a symbiotic relationship with us. they're not. In one dimension, the world remains completely unipolar, the military dimension. I mean, there's no other power that's even in shouting distance or even trying. And there are now what are called the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Okay, that's a unit. The world is becoming more diverse. And the most striking case, I think I didn't talk about much, is Latin America. I mean, Latin America has been, the backyard. Nixon, when the Nixon administration was getting ready to overthrow Allende, the National Security Council pointed out that if we can't control Latin America, how are we going to control the world? This is taken for granted. We've got to control Latin America. Well, that's declining. The South America, for the first time in 500 years, is moving towards some kind of integration and towards facing its horrific internal problems. I mean, virtually every Latin American country is kind of like Honduras, where we just praised the democratic election. There's a tiny, rich elite, mostly white or Europeanized. They're just in a sea of misery, and the rich have no responsibility for the country. It's one of the main reasons why Latin America doesn't develop, and East Asia did. But it's changing. I mean, there are moves towards integration. There are moves towards facing some of these problems different ways in different countries. The U.S. is having a hard time with it. I mean, in 1964, Kennedy could just organize a military coup to overthrow the social democratic government in Brazil. Well, Goulart's, the president's policies were not very different from Lula today, but now they can't do that. In fact, Lula is sort of the fair-haired boy because he's presented as being less extreme than the bad guys. It's mostly presentation. So, for example, like if Chavez praises Ahmadinejad, horrors. When Lula praises Ahmadinejad even more, silence. They couldn't keep it completely silent when Ahmadinejad visited Brazil a couple of weeks ago, so then there was some tapping on the wrist. But that difference is a striking one. And what it reflects is the fact that the major weapons for controlling Latin America have very much declined in efficacy. One is economic strangulation, and that kind of declines as the world becomes more diverse. And the other is just plain military power. So the U.S. has been kicked out of all of its bases in South America. The last one was a couple of months ago in Ecuador. But the U.S. is reacting, as you'd expect. So the U.S. now has 7 new bases in Colombia, and Obama has quietly added 2 more, 2 naval bases in Panama. The 4th Fleet, which was disbanded in 1950, covers that region, has been reconstructed. Training of Latin American military officers is going way up. Their mission is to combat radical populism, and everybody in Latin America understands what that means. So there are efforts to rebuild the weapons, but it's not as easy as before. So yeah, that's a shift in world power, and a significant one. There are also South-South relations developing. I mean, just a couple of days ago, there was a trade agreement with Brazil, India, China, and a couple other powers, I forget, but kind of like a South trade agreement. Okay, those are all new things, and they do diffuse world power. So it might lead to a more multipolar world, which I think would be a very good thing.
That are great against this, a movement for change. How? I mean, we saw what happened to Martin Luther King. We saw what happened to, Malcolm X, and even Fred Hampton. He was very articulate. He started to, the FBI went right in. They had to get. Is it possible to create some kind of movement or a political party? Should we be supporting the Greens? Is there any hope that the Democrats can be brought further left? Do we need to create a new left in the United States, a highly organized left, like it did exist in the 1960s up until very recently? What mechanism can we do to translate your brilliant ideas into action? Or you name the problems so well. How can, when we leave here tonight, what can we begin to do?
The same way it's always. I think we know the answers. It involves organizing, which is hard work. You have to keep at it. It doesn't happen in one day. You've got to be dedicated to it. I'd like to say, take the civil rights movement, which you mentioned. Yes, Martin Luther King was killed, but he would have been the first to say that he did not create the civil rights movement. He was riding on a wave of lots of that action, which goes way back. We're kind of not allowed to say this, but a lot of it was the Communist Party. Quiet, don't say it. But there was, there's decades, in fact, of activism, which, and even in the 60s, the movement was led by people whose names we don't even know, like every popular movement, like the SNCC workers, who were riding freedom buses and sitting in at lunch counters. And that created a substantial support, which gained, the Kennedy administration tried to block it, but finally Johnson kind of authorized it. It had support from the North, crucially, as long as it was attacking racist sheriffs in Alabama. If you take a look at the reactions in the North at the same time, it was quite different. I can talk about that if you like. But it followed the imperial ideology, their crimes, not ours. But it was significant, and Martin Luther King was a very important person. Remember when he was assassinated. He was assassinated when he was organizing a poor people's movement. He was killed in support of a sanitation workers' strike. Okay, that was too much. He stopped being a hero when he wasn't just attacking racist sheriffs in Alabama, but was talking about organizing people, of course, opposing the war in Vietnam. Then his reputation kind of declined among important people like us, the people who write books and articles. But it was a real popular movement, a major one, made many successes, and there was a lot more. This is a very different country from what it was in the 60s. I mentioned just one thing. You couldn't write that diplomatic history that I quoted from 1969, and nobody could write that today, even in anywhere in the country. Okay, that's a change in consciousness, but it's also a change in it changed behavior, attitudes, understanding. Probably the most important movement that grew out of the 60s in terms of its effect on the country was the women's movement. Well, it didn't start in the 60s. Germs were there, but it really picked up in the 70s and later. The solidarity movements, which are very important. That's the first time in the history of imperialism. There's no other country that I know of which ever had anything like the American solidarity movements. Like people in France didn't go live in a Vietnamese village or Algerian village to help people and protect them from the white predators. But that happened in the United States in the 80s in a very substantial level. Mostly it's kind of Main Street, it's coming from Midwest, Southwest, evangelical movements. And it's still there. There are solidarity workers all over the place, very brave. And the anti-nuclear movement took off in the 1980s, and it's kind of interesting to see the way elites respond. Read today's Financial Times, British papers. There's the new European Union foreign minister, Lady Ashton, was being grilled on her past, and one of the charges against her was, and she had to kind of apologize for this, was that she was a supporter of CND, Committee on Nuclear Disarmament, which was part of a mass popular movement, reached about 80% in the United States against nuclear weapons. So that's a charge against her in elite circles. But there's a lot of, public is there. So we're in a much better position, easy to go on, but we're in a much better position now than people were in the 60s to carry all this forward. We've got their legacy to build on. And the methods are the old ones. There's nobody's got a magic key. I think it's absurd to claim that we can't do it. Just take a look at some of the South American countries, like the poorest country in South America, Bolivia. That's had democratic elections of a kind we can't even dream of. So like in 2005, the majority of the population, the most repressed people in the hemisphere, the indigenous population, actually entered the political arena, elected someone from their own ranks, poor peasant, on real issues, which everybody knew, not hope and change, but the real issues, control of resources, justice, cultural rights, complex society. And election day was not of any particular importance. It was just one day in a constant ongoing struggle. And that's one of the reasons why the United States why the coverage of Bolivia, is so harsh and critical. I mean, they had real democratic achievements. That's scary. Well, it's ridiculous to claim that we can't do what Bolivian peasants can. Of course we can. I mean, it's not going to happen by itself. Never has.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question here.
I've been criticized for calling American imperialism and had trouble why America's imperialist when it differs in some ways from classical European imperialism, or even the way we were in the Soviet era. So I was hoping you could articulate an argument exactly how the U.S. is imperialist.
How does it?
Why is the what is the argument for why the United States is
Washington, who called it an infant empire. Conquest of the national territory is imperialism. They didn't doubt it in the 19th century. There is what some historians of imperialism call a saltwater fallacy, meaning you call it imperialism only if it crosses salt water. So like if the Mississippi were like the Irish Sea, say, you'd call it imperialism. But that doesn't make sense. If you ask the victims, of course it was imperialism, just as George Washington said. Yeah, it's different from other countries. Germany was different from England, and so on and so forth. And there are some real innovations if you look at the history. I don't have time to talk about it, but there's a terrific book that just came out, which is very illuminating about this. It's by Alfred McCoy, who's a historian at Wisconsin, who's a Philippine specialist. He just came out with a very interesting study, which has a lot of current implications on how the United States, it's the first real study on what the United States did in the Philippines after conquering it. They invaded, conquered it, Christianized them, all the usual stuff, killed a couple 100,000 people, but then they had to do something. And that part hasn't yet been studied, but he went through a ton of archival records, and what was done was quite interesting. The U.S. used the highest available current technology, it was then telegraph, radio, that sort of thing, to construct a surveillance society of a kind that never existed until the present. They tried to establish total control over individuals. They also worked out techniques to break up nationalist groups by infiltrating, sowing rumors, all sorts of things. Of course, they had to co-opt the Filipino elite, but that's always easy. They established you have to have a mailed fist, so there was the Philippine constabulary, if things got out of control. And that lasts until today. The Philippines are still under that system. That's one of the reasons they are the unique part of the region that didn't undergo the rise of the tigers. Furthermore, there was a blowback. Woodrow Wilson imposed something similar, using similar techniques during and after the First World War, and it's coming now. So, surveillance societies, let's say Britain is more advanced than the U.S. in this respect. But the most striking example, in fact, is Israel and the occupied territories. It's exactly what they're doing, and they're being praised for it. So John Kerry, who's like Obama's spokesperson, gave a very important speech on Israel-Palestine, the most detailed Obama administration speech yet on what should be done. And it was the usual stuff. We're a neutral, honest broker. We try to do everything wonderful and so on. But if you throw out the boilerplate, he did say something. He said that all this time, Israel and us have been trying desperately to find a legitimate negotiating partner among the Palestinians. We've always failed. Okay. But now, finally, we may have a legitimate negotiating partner. And his reasons were interesting. His reasons were that during the Gaza war, there weren't any protests in the West Bank. And there weren't any protests because the U.S. had established an army run by General Keith Dayton, which is analogous to the Philippine Constabulary. They had an army which was able to quash any protests. And actually that's the soft part of the repressive forces. That's under State Department control, so kind of a little gentle. There's also a CIA-run force, which apparently is much harsher. But anyway, we've got good repressive forces there. They're able to control the population, keep them quiet. There's an elite, as always. If you go to Ramallah, people are living fine. They get a ton of European Union money coming in, so on and so forth. So it's taking the shape of a traditional neocolonial system of the kind that the United States, in fact, innovated. That was different from European colonialism. And it's been applied in other countries under U.S. control. Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, a lot of massacre and destruction, but then left in the hands of a National Guard, Philippine Constabulary, and a cooperative elite. In fact, that's just what's going on before our eyes in Honduras. So yes, those are innovations. So we're somewhat different from other imperial countries. Also, again, I stress that this is settler colonialism, the U.S. It's like Australia. You exterminate the natives. Europe is different. Violent, savage history, maybe the most savage place in the world, but they didn't slaughter everybody. Okay? In fact, they sort of kept the traditional institutions. And part of the reasons why you have, mildly social democratic structures in Europe is that the modern Europe grew out of a feudal society. The United States didn't. It was a blank slate. And in feudal societies, everybody has a place. Might be a lousy place, but you have some place. And that kind of evolved into, social democratic systems beyond what we have. So sure, we're different, but often not in very attractive ways.
Okay, the next question here.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much.
Well, your entire career. But my question is, despite the actual motivations of the culture of imperialism, is there no actual credence to the claim that President Obama made this week that a rapid pullout from Afghanistan, and a rapid pullout of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, and we can apply that to Iraq and the 800 U.S. military bases around the world, would negatively affect U.S. security?
Picture. Is there any truth to the claim of President Obama that a rapid pullout from Afghanistan or other parts of the world would adversely affect American security here at home? Is there any truth to that claim?
The United States is the most secure country in the world. And, I mean, if you accept, say, John Lewis Gaddis's principle, expansion is the path to security, yeah, we're not going to be secure until we control every inch of the world. But if you, by any sensible measure of security, the United States is unusually secure. And it has been for a long time. I mean, the United States wins every war for a good reason. There are no comparable enemies. The United States pretty much controls, even if, say, Bolivia isn't totally under control, the U.S. pretty much controls the hemisphere, controls both oceans, controls the opposite sides of both oceans substantially. You can't totally prevent. I mean, there are things like terror. But there are ways to stop terror if you care about it. First of all, I'm not even talking about our terror, which overwhelms everyone else's. But the bad terror, the terror of the bad guys, yeah, you can stop it. There are ways to do it. I mentioned a couple, and there are others. Nir Rosen, who's one of really top-flight journalists, one of the best in the Middle East region, just recently was on Democracy Now! You might have seen him. He was asked something like, what do we do in Afghanistan or something? He really knows the region well. And he said, if you want to stop Muslims killing you, stop killing them. not a bad answer. And then concretely said, okay, do something about Kashmir, where the terrorists are bad enough. The Indian Army has been monstrous. So do something about that. Do something about Palestine. Do something about the other grievances. They're real. And then you'll undermine the kind of support that extreme elements rely on. So yeah, there are things to do if you want to increase security. But if you want to increase control, which is very different from security, you do different things.
1 second, ma'am. We are beginning to get toward the end, so I'm going to ask maybe a couple of people to ask questions, and then Professor Chomsky can respond to them, not just individually. So go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be very quickly. I'd like to turn our attention to domestic shores. Can you give us some insight into why the U.S. ruling class chose to support and to assure the election of Barack Obama to the tune of $1 billion, the most expensive campaign in the history of this country, and even giving us these Alice in Wonderland political paradigms of a post-racial America? What are the broader implications of his presidency for this country, both in terms of race relation, the increasing attacks against the working class, and the implications of whether or not we will pull out of this depression?
Statement, but a question, but it's really about what are the implications of Obama's election for race in America.
I see.
Okay, the next, why don't you ask a question also? Yes.
Okay. I'm a foreign student from, and I'm also, as a language teacher, I just started teaching language arts at a very challenging district in New York City. And what can linguists or language teacher like me or you can help student understanding the world more easier or help the world?
Is this related to Professor Chomsky's other career as a linguist? She's a language teacher in public schools in New York and wants to know what you can suggest as how a language teacher can help improve the world. Why don't you take the one about Obama and the other about language?
I mean, the fact that there's a black family in the White House, I think is really significant, and no matter what you think about Obama. And that's bound to have effects. It's having multiple effects. For the black community, it was kind of, it's a real lift. Like, whatever happens, they may make out worse than before, but nevertheless, it's some kind of a lift. It's having a counter effect. I mean, this is kind of, hard to be sure. Like, you may have heard Jimmy Carter, a couple recently, claimed that the almost hysterical hatred of Obama, which is beyond anything that I don't know of historical analog to it here. He suggested, it has its roots in race. Maybe. I don't know how you estimate that, but I think that's some factor. As for the actual impact of the policies on black people, I don't see any reason to think it's going to be good. You just take a look at the policies that are being pursued. I mean, Obama is almost like a caricature of one of the most persuasive and well-supported theories about American political life that I know, namely Thomas Ferguson's, what he calls the investment theory of politics. He says, let's take a look at elections as occasions on which groups of investors coalesce to invest to control the state. We call that an election. And then the policies, he argues, pretty well follow the groups of investors, and he's done pretty impressive work on this for over a century. Obama's almost like a caricature. He was put into office by the financial institutions, who much preferred him to McCain. So the core of the funding apparently came from financial institutions. You got its tricky estimate, you can look at bundling and all kinds of things, but that's what it looks like, and they're getting everything they want, I mean, bonuses, bank profits, they're just exulting. It's like a great victory. Okay, that's what you'd expect. Things like, EFCA and other things are languishing, but it's kind of what you'd expect. I mean, he came in as a kind of centrist Democrat in the Clinton model, and those are the policies. I mean, they're not as harsh as some say Reagan, or Bush, but it's pretty much within the same spectrum. So the effects on blacks are likely to be pretty bad, just as they were under Clinton. We can change that, of course. I mean, any president, no matter who it is, responds to public opinion. That was true, for example, of Nixon, who in many ways was the last liberal president we've had. But there was a response to public opinion, and there were some pretty good policies domestically. So I don't know how to predict it. I mean, it's just like a matter of will and choice. We have to change it.
And the language teacher, your advice to her?
Well, in language teaching itself, it's like any other kind of teaching. I mean, there are two ways to do it, basically. I mean, you do it like the Marine Corps, which is called No Child Left Behind. You train people to be obedient, submissive, pass the test, forget everything you learned when you pass the test. We've all been through that in our own experience. Ensure, obedient, passive students. That's a bipartisan program. Or you can try to encourage kids' natural creativity and search for. Kids are curious; they want to learn things. Learning language for children is extremely, ridiculously easy. I mean, it's like a sponge, and water just comes. So set up the conditions under which it will come naturally, and in the course of that, you can also encourage their own creativity, exploring, imaginative work, writing things, and so on and so forth. But that's a matter of kind of like how you deal with, how you deal sensibly with young people, whether you're a parent or a teacher or anything else. I don't think language teachers or linguists or physicists or anyone else has anything special to say about the kind of problems we're talking about. I mean, each of us, if we're kind of decent human beings, are not just kind of like focused on some professional problem. Can I prove this theorem, say? But we're also human beings. They're concerned about the world. Okay, that's part of your life, and you have to decide what you're going to do with that part of your life. Lots of choices.
Let me I think just two more here. Very quickly pose a question, and then Professor Chomsky will answer, and we'll have to end.
I just want to ask, while we're talking about domestic issues, Congress has passed the Patriot Act and the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and opponents of both acts say that the government is just attempting to oppress opinions against their policies and opinions against what the U.S. conservative group wants to do. So I wanted to ask, I mean, you said that we're in a better place now than in the 60s. I mean, people will say that because these acts are being passed and we're not allowed sometimes to speak out against the United States, we're in a worse place. So how would you respond?
Patriot Act is unpleasant, but in terms of what people live with all over the world, it's kind of like a tea party. And in fact, the repression in the 60s was far worse. Take a look at the record. Somebody mentioned Fred Hampton before. Okay, Fred Hampton was assassinated, Gestapo-style assassination set up by the FBI. Was part of a major program, COINTELPRO, which was directed first back. It went through 4 presidents, run by the National Political Police, the FBI. It attacked everybody. It started small and ended up attacking the black movements, the women's movement, the entire New Left, anything you thought of. And it was no joke. It went on until the mid-'70s. There's nothing like that now. And that was nothing like Wilson's Red Scare. I mean, yeah, we don't like it when people are repressive, but I mean, the kind of repression that we face is so slight as compared with what people live with all over the world that we really don't have much of a right to talk about it, I don't think. I mean, we should object to it. There are things to protest. For example, we should protest things like, say, incarceration, which is a very ugly technique of control, especially the U.S. style. I mean, it's the only country that targets children. Amnesty International came out with a report a couple of years ago investigating around the world children who were in jail for life with no possibility of parole. I don't remember the exact numbers. It was something like 2,500 around the world, of whom maybe 2,300 were in the United States, something roughly like that. I mean, this included like 12-year-old kids who were present when a felony, when a murder took place. So they're in jail for life, no possibility of parole. Just the numbers incarcerated are out of sight. I mean, back around 1980, it was like the rest of the world, you know, the industrial countries, maybe a little high. But through the Reagan years and the Clinton years and on till today, it's just shot out of sight. A lot of it is under drug war pretexts, I stress, and it's targeted primarily black males, also black women, Hispanics to an extent. And if you think about the history, I mean, Eric can say this much better than I can, but if you look at African American history, it's been one of almost constant slavery. I mean, it was literal slavery for much of the black population up until Civil War. And then there was a period of Reconstruction, 10 years, and went right back to what it was pretty much through criminalization. I mean, black life was criminalized. You know, you're standing on a street corner, you look the wrong way at a white woman, whatever, you go to jail forever. A large part of the U.S. Industrial Revolution was based on what amounts to slave labor, you know, criminalized blacks. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that the treatment of blacks in the post-Reconstruction period was worse than slavery, at least as far as I can make out, for good capitalist reasons. You know, if you own a slave, that's capital. You got to kind of keep it, have to take care of it. If you just pick it up from the, you know, from the jails, where the state is doing the work of criminalizing black life, okay, who cares? Work them to death and throw them away and get the next one. Well, there was that really went on until the Second World War. During the Second World War, there was a need for free labor. Then comes a couple of decades of, you know, when blacks could kind of work their way into the skilled labor force, you know, become an auto worker, that kind of thing. But it was over by the mid-'70s, by the shift in the economic programs to financialization of the economy and undermining of productive capacity. And right after that comes the incarceration, which I think if you look at it in many ways is kind of structurally similar to the post-Reconstruction you know, criminalization and slavery period. So there's a whole history, you know. I mean, this is, you know, a sketch. It's more complex, obviously. I don't know if you think that's more or less
Well,
accurate,
we don't have time to get a full, but that's fine. All right, the final question, very briefly, please.
I would like to thank you first for being here today. Second, as a Palestinian, I'm appreciative of you spreading the truth about what's going on in Israel. I would like to ask you a question about Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski, I would like to ask you a question about him. He was very influential in the Obama transition team. I believe he was an advisor. We know that he created the Mujahideen to fight in Afghanistan. I was wondering what were your views on him?
What are your views on him?
Well,
former professor at Columbia.
In 1998, Brzezinski gave a famous interview in which he took credit for creating the Mujahideen. Okay, we don't really have much evidence that ever happened. I mean, he was National Security Advisor under Carter, and it's true that there was a kind of a trickle of aid that went to Mujahideen, but it really took off under Reagan. So I don't know if he was boasting or if it's true. He was taking credit for overthrowing the Soviet Union, essentially. In fact, he was asked in that interview. Yeah, he was asked in that interview. It was in France. Don't you think it's kind of ugly to destroy Afghanistan by supporting these radical Islamist fanatics? He said, well, you know, if you weigh in the light of history, what's more important, the fate of Afghans or overthrowing the Soviet Union? That's basically his answer. Whether it was true, I don't know. I don't think we have much evidence for it. But he was on the Carter transition team, and I should say that on the Obama transition team. And in the spectrum of policy analysts, he's one of the saner ones, I think. And a lot of what he says makes pretty good sense on the Middle East too. I don't like him. I'm sure he wouldn't like me, but a lot of it's pretty rational. Not just there. For example, on the anti-missile systems in Europe, which is a big topic in itself, he's the one person up in the foreign policy elite who I've seen who said straight out what the truth is. It's a non-functioning technology against a non-existent threat. And that's quite true. I mean, even if Iran had nuclear weapons and missiles, nobody wants that, of course, but the chances that they would use them are like minuscule. The U.S. intelligence analysts say it's undetectable. All they have to do is load a missile, and the country gets vaporized. If they have them at all, it's for deterrence. And that would be understandable with a hostile superpower occupying two countries on their borders, Israel threatening to attack them all the time. So, yeah, maybe they're developing, I don't know. But at least he said it sensibly. He's also been one of the few people who's talked openly about the fact that, we should go ahead and sort of break our 35-year opposition to a diplomatic settlement in Israel-Palestine and join the world on this. So, right. Pretty reasonable, I think.
Well, let us all thank Noam Chomsky for coming.
Imperialist policy of the U.S. government, this giant empire that knows that it cannot survive, that it cannot live without exploiting and raping and pillaging the resources of the world, particularly the developing world. That's who Barack Obama is. That's who he has always been, and that is who he will continue to be. It is time for a new dawning. It is time for a new day. New York City will take on Bloomberg. That he does not own this city. That he will not take the policy. That we will have communities. We will have communities based on the respect that our people
and the arrests and the political prisoners right here, and the climate that comes with the demonization and criminalization of Arab and Muslim people. Today, Lynne Stewart was in court, and I think in calling up Ralph Poynter, husband of Lynne Stewart, please join me in chanting, "Free Lynne Stewart! Free 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 Lynne Stewart!" And now he's going to give us an update and a struggle talk.
I would like to thank you for having me. For tonight, there is a voice that is missing. A voice that long ago recognized the criminalization of the poor at home, the criminalization of the poor and the joblessness that forced them to join the military so that they could be cannon fodder so that the rich could get more. A voice is missing that long ago understood the imperialism and the racism at home as well as abroad. A voice that understood through her fight against racism against non-white people and included other religions, Muslims. Long ago understood that the Muslim community was as much a part of America as every other community. A voice that long ago understood the anti-immigrant feeling when she spoke at a rally and said the only difference between many of the people here and my relatives, my forefathers, is that they were white and you are not. That they were Christian and you were Muslim. And this was what brought on your oppression. A voice that long ago understood freedom lies in cooperation of people of the same demand. All of us or none of us. A voice that understood inclusiveness of people of like minds and of people who support justice. When we get it together, this empire will fall. So I say to all of you, from Lynne Stewart on the inside, who said, never stop educating, never stop organizing, and give the message, all of us or none of us.